My daughter Emma is 8 years old and she is dying. The doctors gave her 2 weeks, maybe 3. And yesterday she opened her eyes for the first time in 4 days and whispered, "Daddy, I want to be a real princess in a real castle before I go." And my heart shattered into a million pieces because Emma has spent half her life in hospitals fighting leukemia that keeps coming back no matter how many treatments, how many surgeries, how many prayers. And now the doctors say there is nothing left to try. Her body cannot handle more chemo. Her immune system is collapsing, and all we can do is make her comfortable and wait for the end. But I am her father, and fathers do not give up. So when she asked to be a princess, I said, "Yes, baby, you will be a princess." And I meant it. My name is Thomas Schmidt. I am 42 years old. I am a bush pilot in Bavaria, Germany, flying a specially modified Pilatus PC-6 Porter for mountain rescue operations. And 3 days ago, I made a decision that might send me to prison, but will make my dying daughter's last wish come true, because the castle Emma is talking about is Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle that inspired Disney's Cinderella, the castle she has stared at in picture books since she was 3 years old when the cancer first appeared. And she would point at the towers and say, "Daddy, someday can we fly there?" And I always said, "Yes, Emma, someday." And now someday is running out, and the castle sits on a mountain peak with a tiny courtyard, barely large enough for a STOL aircraft landing. If I am willing to risk everything, and I am, because some promises matter more than rules, more than safety, more than anything. Emma was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia when she was 3 years old. And I remember the oncologist sitting us down, my wife, Maria, and me, and saying, "Your daughter has cancer." And those 4 words destroyed our world, because Emma was just a baby. She was perfect and beautiful and full of life. And suddenly we were being told that life might be very short. And we spent the next 5 years fighting, watching our little girl endure chemotherapy that made her so sick she could not eat, radiation that burned her skin, bone marrow, transplants that nearly killed her. And through it all, she never complained, never cried, never asked, "Why me?" She just fought. Maria bought her a picture book about princesses and castles, trying to give her something beautiful to focus on during the treatments. And Emma fell in love with Neuschwanstein, with its white towers and mountain setting and fairy tale magic. And she would make us read about it every night. And she would say, "When I am better, we will fly there. Right, Daddy? You can land your plane at the castle." And I would say, "Yes, Emma, when you are better, we will fly there together." And she would smile, and that smile kept me going, kept me believing that somehow she would beat this, that we would have our flight to the castle, that there would be a happy ending to this nightmare. But cancer does not care about happy endings. Emma went into remission twice, and both times it came back angrier and more aggressive. And 3 months ago, the doctors called us in for a meeting, and they said, "We have tried everything. The cancer is resistant to treatment. Her body cannot handle more chemotherapy. And we think it is time to consider palliative care, to focus on quality of life for whatever time she has left." And Maria broke down sobbing, and I sat there, numb, thinking, this cannot be happening. My baby cannot be dying. She is only 8 years old. She has not even lived yet. We brought Emma home and set up hospice care, and nurses came daily to manage her pain, and she slept most of the time, her body shutting down piece by piece. And Maria and I took turns sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, telling her stories about all the things we would do together, knowing they were lies, knowing there would be no more birthdays, no more Christmases, no more anything. And the guilt of that knowing of those broken promises ate at me every single day. because I had promised Emma we would fly to Neuschwanstein and we never did, because there was always another treatment, another hope, another reason to wait. 4 days ago, Emma stopped waking up. She slipped into what the doctors called a semi-conscious state where she was technically alive, but not really present. And they said this is often how it happens. At the end, the body just slowly shuts down, and it could be days or hours, and we should say our goodbyes. And I sat there looking at my little girl, so small, so pale, surrounded by machines, and I thought I failed her. I promised her we would fly to that castle, and I gave her hospitals. I promised her princess dreams, and I gave her nightmares of needles and pain. Then yesterday, something impossible happened. Emma's eyes opened, not the half-open, unfocused stare we had seen for days, but really opened clear and aware. And she looked at me and whispered. Daddy and I grabbed her hand and said, I am here, baby. I am right here. And she said, Daddy, I had a dream. I was in the castle, the one with the towers, and I was wearing a princess dress, and I was flying there in your plane, and I was so happy. And then she started crying and said, but it was just a dream, and I am never going to really go there, am I, because I am dying. And hearing those words from my 8-year-old daughter broke something fundamental in me. I looked at Maria and I looked at Emma, and I made a decision right there in that moment, and I said, Emma, you are going to that castle. You are going to be a princess. I promise you, we are going to fly there together. And she smiled weakly and said, Daddy, you do not have to lie to make me feel better. And I said, I am not lying, baby. We are flying to Neuschwanstein tomorrow, and you are going to wear a princess dress, and you are going to see those towers up close. And she looked at me with hope in her eyes, real hope for the first time in months, and said, really, Daddy, really? And I said, yes, really. And then she closed her eyes and slipped back into unconsciousness, but she was smiling. Maria pulled me aside and said, Thomas, what are you doing? You cannot make promises like that. She cannot travel. She can barely breathe without oxygen. She is dying. And I said, I know, but she wants this, Maria. She wants to be a princess. And I am going to give her that, even if it kills me. And Maria said, how? Thomas, how are you going to get a dying child to a castle on a mountain peak? And I said, I am going to fly her there in the porter land in the courtyard. And Maria stared at me and said, you cannot land at Neuschwanstein. There is no runway, no clearance. And I said, I know, but there is a courtyard. And if I am very skilled or very lucky, I can land there. And Maria said, you will go to prison. They will arrest you. And I said, I do not care. Our daughter is dying, and I am going to give her this one last beautiful thing. I spent the next 2 days planning in secret, because if the authorities knew what I was attempting, they would stop me. I studied satellite images of Neuschwanstein's courtyard. I calculated approach angles, wind patterns, the exact dimensions needed for a STOL landing, and I realized this was possibly the most dangerous landing I would ever attempt. The courtyard is surrounded on 3 sides by stone walls that rise 40 meters high, with towers on each corner, and the only approach is from the south, threading between 2 mountain peaks with unpredictable alpine winds that could slam me into the castle walls. But I had landed the porter in worse conditions. I had flown rescue missions in the Alps. In storms, I had landed on glacier strips, barely longer than the plane itself. I had extracted climbers from mountain ledges and crash victims from forest clearings, and I told myself, this is just another mission, just another impossible rescue, except this time I was rescuing my own daughter from a reality too cruel to accept, and I would either succeed or we would die trying, and honestly, either outcome seemed better than watching Emma waste away in that hospice bed. I also had to find a princess dress, and this part was harder than planning the flight, because I could not just walk into a store and buy one without Maria asking questions. So I called my sister Anna and explained what I was doing, and she was silent for a long moment, and then she said, Thomas, this is insane, but also the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, and I will help you. and she went to 3 different costume shops and found a perfect pale blue dress, like Cinderella, with sparkles and layers, and she brought it to me and said, "Emma is going to look like a real princess." And I hugged her and said, "Thank you for believing in this." The hardest part was Emma herself, because she was barely conscious most of the time, and moving her would be dangerous, possibly fatal. But I consulted with her hospice nurse, Sophie, privately, and I said if I wanted to take Emma on a short flight, how dangerous would it be? And Sophie looked at me with understanding in her eyes and said, "Thomas, where are you taking her?" And I told her everything about the castle, about Emma, his dream, about my plan to land in the courtyard. And Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "Officially, I have to tell you, this is a terrible idea. Emma is very fragile, the stress could kill her. But unofficially, if my child was dying and wanted one last beautiful thing, I would do exactly what you are doing." Sophie helped me prepare medical equipment, portable oxygen monitors, pain medication, everything Emma might need during the flight. And she said, "I am going to note in her chart that Emma is having a good day." And we decided to move her to a more comfortable room, which gives you a 4-hour window before anyone questions where she is. And I said, 4 hours is enough. And she hugged me and whispered, "Give her the fairy tale, Thomas, give her the magic." And I promised I would. On the morning of the flight, I woke Maria at 5 a.m. and said it is time, and she knew immediately what I meant, and she said, "Thomas, are you sure about this?" And I said, "No, I am terrified, but Emma wants to be a princess, and today she will be." And Maria nodded and said, "Then let us make our daughter a princess." And we went to Emma's room and carefully dressed her in the blue gown while she slept. And when we finished and stepped back, Maria started crying, because Emma looked exactly like Cinderella, exactly like the princess she had always dreamed of being. We carried Emma to my truck so gently, afraid any movement might hurt her, might be the thing that finally breaks her fragile body. And I drove to the small private airfield where I keep the porter, and the sun was just rising, painting the Alps gold and pink. And I thought, please let this work. Please let me give her this one beautiful thing. And Maria held Emma in the back seat, whispering to her about the castle, about the adventure we were about to have. And Emma's eyes fluttered open once, and she whispered, "Are we flying to the castle?" Daddy and I said, "Yes, baby, we are flying to your castle." At the airfield, I had already prepared the porter the night before, removed the rear seats, installed a makeshift bed with pillows and blankets, and secured oxygen equipment. And I lifted Emma so carefully and laid her on that bed, and Maria climbed in beside her. And I said, "Are you both ready?" And Maria said, "Yes. Thomas, take our princess to her castle." And I climbed into the pilot seat and started the engine, and the porter roared to life. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment where I either become the father who gave his daughter a fairy tale, or the father who killed her trying. But I could not think about that. I could only think about Emma's smile when she saw those towers. We took off at 6:15 a.m. and I climbed to 3,000 meters and turned southeast toward Neuschwanstein. And the morning was perfect, clear skies, light winds, the Alps stretching endlessly below us, white peaks and green valleys. And I looked back and saw Emma was awake, her eyes wide, staring out the window at the mountains, and she whispered, "Daddy, it is so beautiful." And Maria was crying happy tears for the first time in months. And I said, "Just wait, Emma, wait until you see the castle." At 6:45 I saw it, Neuschwanstein rising from a mountain ridge, white towers against blue sky looking exactly like something from a fairy tale. And I called back, "Emma, can you see it?" And she sat up slightly, Maria supporting her, and she gasped, "Daddy, it is real, it is really real." And I said, "Yes, baby, it is real, and we are going to land there." And she said, "You can really land at a castle, Daddy." And I said, "I can land anywhere for you." And I began my descent toward the most dangerous landing of my life. The approach to Neuschwanstein was terrifying. I had to come in from the south between two peaks with barely 50 meters of clearance on each side, and the wind was swirling unpredictable, bouncing off the castle walls, and the courtyard looked impossibly small from the air, maybe 40 meters long and 20 wide, surrounded by stone walls and towers, and I thought if I come in too fast, we overshoot and crash into the north wall. If I come in too slow, we stall and drop into the ravine below, and there is no margin for error, none. But I had promised Emma, and I was going to keep that promise, so I dropped to 100 meters and lined up with the courtyard and cut power and deployed full flaps, and the porter slowed to barely 50 knots, and we descended, and the castle walls rose up on both sides, blocking out the sky, and Maria was holding Emma, and I could hear her praying, and Emma was silent, just watching, and I was operating on pure instinct. Now years of mountain flying muscle memory, and then the wheels touched stone, and we bounced once, and I hit the brakes, and we rolled forward 20 meters, 30, and stopped 10 meters from the north wall. For 5 seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke. We just sat there in a plain in the courtyard of Neuschwanstein Castle. And then Emma said in this tiny, awed voice, "Daddy, you did it. You landed at the castle." And I unbuckled and turned around and said, "Yes, baby, we are here. You are at your castle." And she smiled, this huge, beautiful smile, and said, "I'm really a princess now." And Maria said, "Yes, Emma, you are really a princess." And we carefully lifted her out of the plane. Emma could barely stand. She was so weak. So we supported her, one on each side, and we walked slowly across the courtyard toward the castle entrance. And she was looking everywhere, at the towers, at the stonework, at the banners hanging from the walls. And she whispered, "It is more beautiful than my dreams." And tourists were starting to gather, people pulling out phones, staring at the plane in the courtyard. And I heard someone say, "Did he just land here? Is that even allowed?" But I did not care. I only cared about Emma. We reached the main entrance, and I had contacted a friend who worked in the castle administration and explained everything. And he had agreed to let us in before official opening hours, and he met us at the door. And when he saw Emma in her princess dress, his eyes filled with tears, and he bowed deeply and said, "Welcome, Princess Emma, to Neuschwanstein." And Emma giggled, actually giggled something she had not done in months, and said, "I am really a princess." And he said, "Yes, you are the most beautiful princess this castle has ever seen." He gave us a private tour through the throne room, the singer's hall, the king's bedroom, and Emma was enchanted by everything. And she kept asking questions about King Ludwig, about the paintings, about the furniture. And even though she was so tired, so sick, she was more alive than I had seen her in years. And Maria and I walked beside her, supporting her, and crying silently because we knew this was goodbye. This was her last beautiful thing, her last adventure, her last moment of joy before the darkness came. In the throne room, Emma sat on the steps where King Ludwig's throne would have been, and she spread her dress around her and said, "Daddy, take my picture. I want to remember being a princess." And I took dozens of photos of her sitting there, smiling, surrounded by Byzantine arches and golden mosaics looking exactly like royalty. And she said, "When I go to heaven, I'm going to tell the angels I was a princess in a real castle." And my heart broke completely because she knew she was dying, and she was facing it with more courage than I ever could. After an hour, Emma was exhausted, barely able to stand, and I said, "Baby, we need to go back to the plane." And she nodded and said, "Okay, Daddy, thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for making me a princess." And we walked back across the courtyard, and tourists were everywhere now taking pictures, asking questions, and one woman shouted, "You are going to be arrested for landing here." And I shouted back, "My daughter is dying, and today she got to be a princess, and I do not care what happens to me." And the woman went silent, and several people started crying, and someone started clapping, and then everyone was clapping. And Emma looked confused and said, "Why are they clapping?" And Maria said, "Because you are a brave, beautiful princess, and everyone can see that. We lifted Emma back into the plane, and I started the engine, and castle security was running toward us, shouting. But I did not wait. I pushed the throttle forward and we rolled across the courtyard, picking up speed, and the north wall was rushing toward us, and I pulled back on the yoke and we lifted off with maybe 5 meters to spare and climbed into the sky, and Emma was looking back at the castle, getting smaller below us, and she said, "Daddy, I was really a princess," and I said, "Yes, baby, you really were and always will be." The flight back took 30 minutes, and Emma slept most of the way her head on Maria's lap. And when we landed at our airfield, an ambulance was waiting because Sophie had called ahead, and paramedics rushed Emma back to hospice. And that night, she slipped into a coma, and the doctors said it could be hours or days. But she was fading, and Maria and I sat beside her bed, holding her hands, and I whispered, "Emma, you were the most beautiful princess, the most brave girl, and I am so proud to be your father." But then something impossible happened. 2 days later, Emma woke up, not just opened her eyes, but really woke up, alert and talking and asking for food. And the doctors ran tests and were stunned because her vitals had improved. Her blood work showed changes they could not explain. And they said, "We do not understand this. We have never seen anything like this." And they used the word remission cautiously. And Emma stayed awake for 3 days, eating, talking, laughing, telling everyone about being a princess at the castle. And then she slipped back into sleep, but this time it was different, it was peaceful. Emma lived for 6 more weeks. 6 weeks the doctors said were impossible. 6 weeks of being awake and happy and making memories. And she talked constantly about the castle, about flying, about being a princess. And she made us promise to show her pictures every day, and she would smile and say, "I really did it. I really was a princess." And 3 weeks after the flight, she was strong enough to walk again, to play again, and the doctors called it miraculous, unexplainable, and I did not care about explanations. I just held my daughter and thanked God or the universe or whatever magic exists in castles for giving us more time. Emma died peacefully 2 months after our flight to Neuschwanstein, surrounded by family, and she was not afraid. She just said, "I got to be a princess, Daddy, I got my fairy tale." And then she closed her eyes and was gone. And at her funeral, we buried her in that blue princess dress, and hundreds of people came, including tourists who had been at the castle that day, who had seen a dying girl become a princess. And they said, "Your daughter taught us that miracles exist, that love can do impossible things." And I stood at her grave and I thought she was right. Emma got her fairy tale, and I got 6 extra weeks with my daughter. 6 weeks, I was told, were impossible. And that is its own kind of miracle. The German Aviation Authority fined me 20,000 euros and suspended my license for 6 months for the unauthorized landing. But they did not press criminal charges because the story had gone viral, and public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive. And the judge who reviewed my case had tears in his eyes and said, "What you did was illegal, but also the most beautiful act of love I have ever witnessed." And I said, "I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times." And he nodded and said, "I believe you." Neuschwanstein Castle now has a small plaque in the courtyard where I landed, and it says, "In memory of Princess Emma, who proved that love can fly to impossible places." And every year, on the anniversary of our flight, Maria and I go back, and we stand in that courtyard, and we remember the day our daughter became a princess. And tourists ask us about the plaque, and we tell them Emma's story, and they cry and they hug us, and they say, "Your daughter was so brave." And we say, "Yes, she was the bravest person we ever knew." I still fly mountain rescue, and sometimes when I pass Neuschwanstein, I dip my wings in salute to Emma, and I think about how she fought cancer with more courage than any adult I have ever known, and how in her final weeks she got to live. Her dream got to be a real princess in a real castle, and how those 6 extra weeks the doctors could not explain were a gift, a miracle, a reminder that sometimes impossible things happen when love is strong enough. And that is what I want people to remember about Emma. Not that she died young, but that she lived fully, that she got a fairy tale, that for one perfect day she was a princess, and nothing, not cancer, not death, not impossibility, could take that away from her.